Hi, thanks so much for coming. It's good to see you all. I'm Claire. I'm the academic curator here at the Benton, and before we begin, I'd like to give an acknowledgement. The Benton Museum of Art at Pomona College acknowledges the Gabalino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovangar, the Tongva world, and is grateful to have the opportunity to work for the indigenous peoples in this place. As an institution located on unceded indigenous land, we pay our respects to our ancestors, elders, and relations, past, present, and emerging. So thank you for joining us for a talk with the incredible artist, Cara Romero. Her work, as you can see, is in our galleries. And so the talk will be moderated by Dr. Miranda Roberts, curator of the Benton exhibition, Continuity, Cahuilla Basket Weavers and Their Legacies at the Benton Museum of Art. Dr. Roberts is a citizen of the Yerington Paiute tribe and Chicana. She has a PhD in Native American history and an MA in public history from the University of California, Riverside. And she is the Native Scholar in Residence at Pitzer College and teaches as a visiting assistant professor in the art history departments at Pomona College. So Roberts has worked as a co-curator at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, where she developed new content for the museum's Native American exhibition hall, Native Truths, Our Stories, Our Voices. She has also curated Still We Smile, Humor as Correction and Joy. The 2020 Native American Invitational Exhibition at Idlewild Arts. So yeah, after the talk, please join us outside. You can see we have some really fabulous looking brownies and coffee and hot drinks, cookies. The galleries also will be open until 10 p.m. so you'll have a chance to see Continuity if you haven't already. And again, Cara Romero's fabulous pieces that we have displayed. Now, it is my pleasure to present Dr. Miranda Roberts.
Oh my God, this thing is so tiny. Hi everyone, good evening. The whole purpose of this talk, of course, is to hear Cara talk about her work and her process and all of those things, but as some of you know, there's been some chaotic stuff happening around the Pomona colleges these past few weeks, and including things that have harmed our Native and Indigenous student community here that I feel like it kind of needs to be brought into context a little bit more about the colonial foundations of California, because it feels as if those have been very much overlooked, especially considering police arresting an Indigenous person on occupied land. And so I am just thinking through what is it that I would like you all to remember. I don't want to take up too much space because I know that you are all mostly here to hear Cara, which is perfectly fine, but I think it's important to kind of lay out a foundation for what I would hope that all of you would remember as we're moving into this like new really scary era of the world, and that you take with you, and that you always remember that you're on Native land and that you're on Tongva land when you're here at Pomona College. Some of what I say or refer to may be triggering to some of you in the attendance, because I do talk about some of the harm introduced to our nations by the Catholic Church in Spain and then Mexico and then America. But it's only to remind people of the brutality that went into the foundation of the state and by extension the university. I reintroduced to you all myself today because you all know me mostly as a doctor, a curator, and a scholar. But before those characterizations, I'm a proud Native or Northern Paiute woman in Chicana. I am the first person in my family to earn any degree in higher education. And as a result, I have faced vastly different lived experience than most of my peers in the academy. I've seen and felt the generational trauma of colonial invasion firsthand, and have spent a great deal of time trying to avoid falling into those same patterns, like drugs, abuse, and jail. And I've seen some of the most brilliant people I've ever known in my family having to succumb to these vices, and have even had to give their eulogies. This pain continues to show up in my life on a daily basis, but ultimately I channel my anger by fighting back against settlers and colonizers in the academy. I believe that the Creator has gifted me with a unique way of seeing the world and formulating what I see into writings, exhibitions, and teachings, which I try to honor. Ultimately, I do this work in the hope that Indigenous people will be liberated from the colonial systems of power, and that our youth can see that there's different ways of surviving in these structures. On top of this, I'm a member of a very small Native American Indigenous student union here at the 5 colleges, and I did not anticipate being in this position, because when I first started to curate continuity, I was not involved with the students. But once I started teaching here in the art history department, I began to interact with them a lot more and to build a lot more community with them. And because my work is so attuned to holding institutionals accountable for the harm they have done to Indigenous communities, as this exhibition shows can be done in truthful and respectful ways, it would be inappropriate not to mention how we as a community were harmed by the actions caused by Pomona leadership in calling in police to arrest peaceful protesters on campus. I won't speak about details, but I will talk about the panic that I felt in my chest the moment that I heard one of my students was arrested, and how the rest of the night I expected to hear about something going wrong at the jail or someone being hurt, even more than they already knew, especially when I consider how law enforcement treats Native youth any chance that they get. In my opinion, though, and this is just my opinion, I want that to be very clear, it seems as if the administration is guilty of misunderstanding how Indigenous people are enfolded in these institutions, and that it has violently chosen to ignore the loud history of brutality Native communities, specifically those in California, experienced at the hands of the Spanish and the Catholic Church, and America and Mexican culture. These experiences occurred in different ways. So Mexicans who governed California after the Spanish used California Indians as free labor on their large ranches. American law prevented Indians from owning land and voting. The US Congress passed a law giving millions of dollars to Americans to round up and kill Indians who were in the way for bounty. These men were also law-abiding citizens who could be considered cops. By leaning into the perceived safety of militarized police forces, this signals to me that leadership is not in touch with the reality of their student body and who makes up their said community. And so I wanted to take a moment to remind most of us how deeply embedded Indigenous erasure is in these spaces of higher education, or how it is willfully ignored, and how it is our collective responsibility to not only witness what is happening here at Pomona College, but also Palestine. Some will want to rewrite what has happened here on campus and abroad. However, oppressors should never be allowed to rewrite history. As writer Cole Arthur Riley states, be careful of those who benefit from our forgetting. There are those who are terrified of shared memory because their present consciousness is implicated when confronted with honest remembering. Keep record, protect the story. So some of the following I'm going to read very quickly because I don't want to take more time. Is adapted from Deborah Miranda's book, Bad Indians. In this book, Miranda, who is a Ohlone, highlights the importance of keeping accurate stories and facts at the center of discussing California's founding, and gives us an alternative way of viewing primary sources. I adapted these words with some of my own experiences to demonstrate that the harm of history is never that far from us. We are all watching evil on our screens daily, not considering what the next generation will go through. And so it's cognizant of the story that will be written about this time and about us in this moment. So this is where the excerpts start, and I promise I'll be quick. Prior to 1969, who was telling our story? Native stories. Non-Indians for the most part. Self-representation was unheard of, and stereotypes and biases were bleeding into American culture. So who tells a story is a mighty piece of information for listeners. You must know what the storyteller has at stake. Demanding to know who is telling your story means asking who is inventing me, for what purpose and what intention. Europeans told stories about Indigenous people in North and South America long before any of them ever left European shores in their small little boats and actually met any Native people. They called them cannibals, they said that they did human-animal offspring, mutated monsters, bloodthirsty devils. The names and stories sank into the minds and identities of Europeans and made them fearful, defensive, and righteous. The stories that had been told about the inhabitants of other lands created, in turn, the stories that played out at first contact were about that: savages, heathens, pagans, barbarians, or other inferior beings. Story is the most important force in the world, or maybe in all worlds. Story is culture. Story, like culture, is constantly moving. It is a river where no gallon of water is the same gallon it was 1 second ago. Yet it is still the same river. It exists as a truth, as a whole, even if the whole is a constant change. In fact, because of that change. All my life, I have heard one thing about Indians, and the author Miranda makes a point of saying, specifically California communities, have heard that they're godless, dirty, stupid, primitive, ugly, passive, drunken, immoral people. But what's funny is that I've also heard that about my Chicano and Chicana ancestors and how damaging that can be to our self-esteem. But the story of the missionization of California starts in 1769, or after. Missionizing much of Mexico, the Spaniards began to move up to the west coast of North America to build and establish claims to rich resources and land before other European nations could get a foothold. Together, the Franciscan priests and Spanish soldiers built a series of 21 missions along what is now coastal California. California's indigenous people, numbering over 1 million at the time, did most of the labor when it came to these missions and lived under brutal, oppressive livelihoods. These missions, some rehabilitated from melting adobe, others in neo-original state, are now one of the state's biggest tourist attractions. Elsewhere, so-called mission decor drenches Southern California, from restaurants to homes, apartment buildings, animal shelters, grocery stores, and post offices. And in many neighborhoods, a bastardization of mission style is actually required by cities or neighborhood associations. Along with this visual mythology of adobe and red clay roof tiles comes the cultural storytelling that drains the missions of their bloody and brutal past. And where I'll stop is how, when I first started here, it was pointed out to me that how many of the campus buildings are resembling missions, like it was a good thing. So the Smith Campus Center and Little Bridges all very much look like missions and are very triggering to some of us who have had family in the missions. So it's not very easy to just say that you can't see that history play out here on campus. And also, I encourage you all to think hard the next time that you go to the Mission Inn in Riverside and think about what that feels like when you're standing there knowing that it's a space for entertainment rather than a space that should be reflective of what those spaces, of what missions really were. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to the phenomenal, the beautiful, the amazing Cara Romero. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Miranda, and thank you for putting together such a beautiful show. Along with the staff at the Benton, I've seen a lot of basket exhibits in my life, and it truly is an honor to be a part of this one and to be able to see them in open air. And it's really just uplifted what they are in such a beautiful way. And I wanted to follow up with the perfect introduction that Miranda gave with story and with my place in this California native landscape, and tell some stories of autobiography and of the people that I come from and the lands that I come from that are not too far from here. I was born in Los Angeles, in Inglewood, Redondo Beach, South Bay in 1977 to interracial parents. They were high school sweethearts at Hawthorne High. And in 1979, our family, our entire family, grandparents, mother, father, my brother and I, aunts and uncles, relocated from the Los Angeles area out to the Chemehuevi Valley Indian Reservation, which is about 300 miles from here, deep in the heart of the Mojave Desert on the California side of the Colorado River, presently Lake Havasu. On the California side of Lake Havasu. It is the second most biodiverse place in the world behind the rainforests, so it's very pristine, intact. It is an incredible landscape full of flora and fauna and desert animals and snakes and all the types of desert wildlife that you can imagine. So it was a wondrous place to grow up. I was raised by really strong women. My grandmother was chairwoman of our tribe when I was young in the 80s. She was our first director of housing that, rebuilt 30 homes on the Chemehuevi Valley Indian Reservation. We come from a long line of really strong women on our reservation. It's something that we experience very often in Southern California. We have a lot of women's leadership and governance, a lot of gender equity within our governance. And I would say a lot of Native communities, the young women are taught that they are as strong and they're allowed to take up space, and they are allowed to be outspoken from a really young age. We're really tough, right? Our Native girls here in California are really tough, and I think that comes out in my artwork and in my voice. My parents split pretty early on, and I ended up going back and forth between Houston, Texas, and the Chemehuevi Valley Indian Reservation. And so I had this urban Indian experience from a pretty young age. It was all the culture shock that you could imagine, leaving a really rural reservation and ending up, it was a majority minority school district in the heart of Houston. Everybody was from everywhere, and I was I'm certainly thankful at this point in my life to have met so many people from so many different backgrounds during that time, and learned about so many different backgrounds. But one of the things that I learned really early on in the city is that people had no understanding of what Native Americans are or contemporary life in academia or media. And so from a really early age, we're talking about this idea of continuity. And so many of the stories that, we're just starting to scratch the surface on now in academia, in media, were told in our homes. While we were not appearing in the Life magazines that I grew up knowing, while we did not see our reflections in Tonto and Lone Ranger and Little Big Man and, all of these different stereotypical portrayals that you alluded to from Hollywood, we did see ourselves in our shoebox of photos. And so I think that there's everybody in the family, like there's one person that just loves the scrapbooks, that loves to pour through the old photos, that can put together all of the family histories, and I think as Native people, we have been holding on to these stories for this idea of continuity, because if we're not the purveyors of the story, then we know that they'll disappear. So we know as far back as we can know through our oral tradition and through these old photographs that exist. As far as story that relates to what Miranda was talking about, also this beautiful woman on the left, her name is Lillian Smith, was my great-grandmother. And Lillian was born not a citizen of the United States. So she was born in right around 1898. This photo was probably taken around 1921. We did not become citizens until 1924 in the United States, so she was not yet a citizen of the United States. She only lived about 11 years past this photo. She died of tuberculosis at 27 years old and orphaned my grandmother and her little brother. My grandmother was born also not a U.S. citizen. She grew up in a ranch outside, right on the border of Nevada and California, in an area called Searchlight, Nipton area. There's a lot of Chemehuevis throughout what is currently like the Mojave National Preserve. So our family's kind of from right there, ancestrally, ranches, a lot of vaqueros, a lot of mixed folks during that time. And as the oral tradition goes in our families, that if you had a little girl and somebody from the government came by, you hid the little girl. So my grandmother, in order to not go into boarding school, anytime a non-native person would come by, they would hide her in the basement or somewhere on the ranch, because it was known that they could take her for indentured servitude. they could take her into slavery. This was only in 1930 here. In California, there was nothing worse that you could be in California than being a Native American. It was very common for people to attempt to pass during the 20s and 30s for Mexican or Spanish-speaking people, because that was the only way that you could get work, watching people's children or cleaning their homes, right? So this is kind of just another layer of continuity, of genocide, of erasure of California Native peoples. Some reservations had been withdrawn. Some people had mission Indian status where their reservations were withdrawn early, but this was still going on. They were hiding children. So when my grandmother's mother died from tuberculosis, she was quarantined for 3 months with her little brother by herself, and then became a ward of the state and lived out the rest of her young life at Sherman Indian School. We also had incredible stories of boxing champions. In the shoebox of photos, we had pictures of my grandmother and her little brother on the ranch. I grew up with photos of people with cars of the time and fashion of the time, and we watched how their clothing changed. We got to see how old items were made still in our communities, and often studied the pictures to look at how they used to make the cradle boards back before we forgot how. There were really cool photos, right? So these like just spurred my creativity as a young person. I was like, this is like the coolest photo, right? Right at the county line. And there were nowhere else up other than our shoebox of photos at home. And so when I first set out to be a photographer, I thought I would make really cool photos like this. And so this is one of my early self-portraits there in the Mojave Desert. One of the things that I wanted to talk about, and like you not take too much time, is in this idea of continuity, what keeps coming up for me is this idea of ontological ties to the landscape, of the interconnectedness of the stories that we tell today, the materials that are collected from the baskets, the continuity of the landscape, the continuity of the songs, the continuity of language preservation, and trying to learn language and relearn language in Native communities that's gone dormant. All of those things are not only inseparableness from self, but they're part of our ecology. And as Native people of California and as settler people of other lands, we all have a responsibility to be part of the ecology of the landscape. The ecology of the landscape, in order to be healthy, needs healthy indigenous people caring for it the way that we've cared for it for thousands of years. It needs indigenous leadership. It needs non-Native people to lean into indigenous leadership to learn how to live in reciprocity with the landscape, how to relearn place-based ways in order to live in a better way. So I just wanted to show a little bit of landscape, show also this shared tradition of basket making in California. Chemehuevis are known as the finest of the Great Basin basket weavers, and we're still collecting very similar materials, and our weaving is just slightly different, but just an incredibly powerful medium. This medium is not healthy. We do not have a lot of weavers left, and people ask why. And the reason why is because of ongoing cultural genocide against the landscape, environmental destruction, development of pristine areas, people not understanding the importance of gathering materials. And so we end up with contemporary peoples and very few weavers. And without the stories, people say, why, right? So this is why the stories are so important. the basket materials grow in the wetlands along the river. So when you cement in the LA River, there go all the basket weaving materials. When you put up a dam and you flood all of the riparian belt, there go all of the basket weaving materials and the people that go along with them. And so just wanted to talk a little bit more about the importance of telling these stories. One of the ways that I try to tell stories is reminding myself and people about our inseparableness from the landscape. That goes back to our creation stories, that goes back to all the stories and all the songs and everything that we have left that teach us that we are from the landscape, but even more that the landscape is from us, right? And so this is a story of creation, that all of the earth and the land that we live on is made from the body of woman. The inseparableness from our waterways, the sacredness of our incredible landscapes here in Southern California, and the importance of land conservancy and preservation for these areas. For Native people, there is a great amount of mythos connected to the landscape. So everything begins from our landscapes. Our languages emerge from the landscapes. Our songs sing about the landscapes, the health and the beauty of the trees and the animals in the landscape. I also like to bring us through time into contemporary times and imagine the ways that these stories that have been passed down for thousands of years appear in contemporary times. And this is like really countering this idea of ethnographic photography from the turn of the century that kind of stopped time for what Native people look like. So we're very familiar with Native peoples and how they looked at the turn of the century because of the photograph. And when we're not able to tell our own stories or our own photography is not given platform, then time stands still, right? And so our representation and our reflection of self begins to also stand still. I'm very interested in, for not only myself, but certainly I think as we've grown up and our grandparents have given us this incredible opportunity to be here against all odds, to have culture and place intact. I think about young people, and the things that I didn't have were ideas of how am I every bit as indigenous in modern times as my ancestors were. And those are stories that were stolen from us because our ancestors and all of our spirits are still here with us and in the landscape and experiencing all of the things with us. And so this is a story, an autobiographical story about our warrior twins, but it's also a real life. It's a mother with her two sons, and the pure indigeneity that our children have that goes back a very long way while we're here in contemporary time. So this is one where if you really start to pick it apart, you are not thinking about linear chronological time anymore, that it's more like everything all at once. I'd like to just go through some of the images a little bit faster and just give you a glimpse into some of my work that really speaks to this California cultural landscape. Bird singing here again is something that we share from the sand to the sea, and it is songs that sing about the health of all things beautiful in our landscape and give us guidance for how to be good people and how to live in a good way. I've been working with these 4 little boys since about 2017. They're growing fast. They're 2 sets of brothers from my reservation. I'm in res kinship Auntie Cara, but really I just grew up kind of babysitting their parents, and it's a small town. And one of the boys, Kiani, is featured on the wall mural in the basket exhibit Continuity, and they are just an incredible group of boys that helped me, and their parents helped us tell a story of how our spirit beings are still here in the desert all around us, experiencing changes, looking over our landscape. And so this series appeared on billboards in the Palm Springs area in 2019 and became part of my fine art portfolio collection. This is Kiani, the same young boy that's on top of the boulders in front of Indian Canyon. And while they represent themselves from the reservation, they're also representing ideas bigger than self, and they're meant to be representative of spirit beings in the landscape, experiencing development of infrastructure and how our ancestors might feel about gigantic wind turbines going into the area, responding to proposed violent walls at the southern border when all of our ancestry once flowed back and forth. Here as protectors in the landscape. So we don't have a word for God. We say Evan Kurur. It means those that sit beside us, meaning that everybody that came before us is around us and protecting us. And just a few more glimpses into fun reservation life. So I'll leave it there.
That was great. But I have a lot of questions, but I also was wondering as you were talking, because if you haven't seen Continuity yet, and you saw this in there when we were in there earlier, there's a series of photographs on the wall where the man who collected and took those photographs didn't take the women's names, but he did like the men's names. Or if he did take a woman's name, it was like really offensive as opposed to like the men's names. So as you're talking, I was just thinking of like, how do you, when you're in your process and what you try to capture, like dramatically, obviously it dramatically differs from these anthropologists and all that, but like, what is the care that you put into, like, you know, making sure your subjects and all of, you know, this like the care that goes into your production, I guess?
That was something that I think faced head on from a really early age, was the exploitive nature of photography, of how photography had almost been weaponized during this time, and how at the same time I was so in love with the medium, right? It was like a deeply conflicting time where I thought, what is it that those photographs don't do, and how can I work with this medium to give back to community, right? And so I think at the forefront is this idea of reciprocity, of giving back, and I think the second idea is around, I think what you're alluding to is agency.
Right. Yeah.
So each person in the photograph has agency, and by that I mean collaborative playfulness and imagination. We're telling stories together. I'm not making photographs in a vacuum about what I think is interesting about a person from either my tribe or another tribe. And so that's, I think, something that emerges very naturally as a Native photographer, is that when you're telling stories from inside culture, that's going to look very different than people peering in and deciding what they think is interesting about your culture culture or about the way you look or about the way you dress, right? And so I think that those are kind of reflective of those ethnographic photos, you know, is like, these are interesting specimen that don't have names, you know, is almost like that feeling, right? And I think with my photographs, you know, they're often titled with the name of the person, with a lot of care. Usually, you know, there's a collaborative process about even the idea going into it, and then showing it to them before it ever is published to make sure, like, do you feel really good about this? You know, does grandma feel really good about this, right? That's the most important, does grandma like it? So,
I mean, yeah.
In our communities, that's important.
No, that's the most important thing, is grandma's happy or not. So what is it, like, because I'm also like really drawn, and this honestly about, you know, your work with Native women specifically, of making sure that they're always shown in a positive and non, you know, like it's a totally not romanticized sort of way. Like, I don't know. I just feel like, I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, because I think that those series that you do with the women, or any of them, are just really profound.
So I think I like to mention that, you know, the women in our communities are vital. Like, we have an uplifting of women in our communities that when we go outside of our communities, we don't see in the same way. And I think when I'm approaching photography, it's often to really examine dominant society, but also photography being dominated by white male canon. And that is a very powerful shift when you have a woman behind the camera, because you have ideas of like the reverse of objectification, ideas of feeling maternal towards, you know, the people that I'm working with. You have also autobiography. You know, I know how I feel about myself. I think we are able to gain a trust and an understanding, and so sometimes you're also telling autobiography through working with other people as a storyteller, and finding commonality. It is really important for me to think about ideas of, especially with the body, being othered and belonging, looks of being omniscient in the photographs. You know, so if you, like, if I'm going through them and I'm like, what look, you know, how is she supposed to look in this photograph? It's when she looks like she knows everything, you know, is a really good one for me to say. I think that this is the one, you know. And so I hope that through all of that, it gives Indigenous women more humanity than we've been lent from the outside world. And I really, truly hope that it gives ideas of self-esteem, and that it counters all the lowbrow stuff that's out there that I consider, you know, the more you're erased and the more that you're dehumanized as a Native woman, that it contributes to things like missing and murdered Indigenous women, because people don't understand that we're real and we have humanity and that we're beautiful and that our communities uplift us. But if you're erased, then the invisibility creates these epidemics that we face.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's leaving me with a lot to think about too. Why do you think it's so easy for people, though, in general, to just forget or willfully ignore Native history here?
Well, I mean, I think it's probably the sixth step in the textbook definition of genocide, right? I mean, it really is. If you look up the steps of how to commit cultural genocide, erasure and omission of existence are part of that, right? And so it's not just our stories, but, you know, many stories in American history that you find people fighting back to tell the truth, to tell the story. And I think it was, for not having to worry about land theft, right? It was, it was tried so many different ways. It was, relocation, forced assimilation, termination, massacre, it just was like one thing after another. But, even though we're experiencing lesser horrors than our grandparents, it's still an ongoing, uncomfortable thing, because what are paths forward? We can look to things like land back. We can look to things like creating, equity within, higher learning systems, but even in early childhood education. That's a big question, right? It's got to be everything. It's got to be, a systemic approach to, counter the erasure, but it's not by coincidence. I think at the heart of your question is that, erasure was by design, and, the stories that we learn of Native history were, to get rid of the Indian problem, right, is how it's taught in Native history. And we're still here, right? That's our mantra, and we're staying, and we're healthy, and we have incredible things happening in our communities as well.
And one more question before I ask any of the students, Claremont College students, if they have any questions. What are you doing right now? What are some of the things, you're traveling a lot, but what are your next projects? And if you want to talk about the work you've just done, was it at the Herd? I don't, or, yeah.
So I'm making a lot of art this year. I'm making a lot of new stuff, which is an exciting space to be in. I'm clearing my calendar and not traveling anymore after the end of April through the rest of this year. I have really the biggest show of my career coming up, and that's a major museum exhibition with 2 decades worth of work, 55 to 60 pieces going up in the Hood, installations, my first book. It's all going to come in January of 25, so I feel the sweat forming on my brow. And but it's also really exciting to be making new work. I've really been with this newer body of work examining within my own community and a truth that I know about uplifting our Afro-Indigenous brothers and sisters in our community. And there is a lot of responsibility as a photographer, not only to course correct and counter a lot of narratives, but also to be incredibly inclusive of our contemporary landscape. And mixed race is part of our landscape. And so when I said I'm often looking to see what's not out there, to me, I was not seeing Afro-indigeneity within our community embraced. And so I've been working on that with my friend Alika, who did some incredible Afro-Indigenous futurist film work, and that's how we met. And so she helped me work on some Afro-Indigenous futurism to go along with my futurism series. And I am constructing in the studio. I'm traveling in the month of June to make new work. So that's all very exciting.
Well, thank you. I'm going to open, if there are questions from Claremont College students, they're going to be preferred or prioritized, I guess. So if there's any from the students, now's the time. Don't be scared. Yes. This is the time to ask them, so. You want to Yes, you want to? I'm going to call you. Nobody? Okay.
Yes, I have a quick question. Just your life is one of art, and so I wanted to ask just, was there a moment in your childhood that you kind of turned into that, or did you have your first great work in your childhood?
I didn't hear it. My life is of art. When did it start? I think I understood. When did I know I was an artist?
Yeah, my bad.
That's okay.
I was just asking, how did you begin that journey? Was there a moment in your childhood that turned you into that, or is there something you would consider your first work that you were proud of?
I think both. I had a difficult, traumatic childhood, which is common to our community. There was lots of drugs and alcohol and instability. Yeah. And when I look back at early childhood, art was like a best friend. It was something that brought me comfort. And so I was always drawing or coloring or daydreaming or going off somewhere. Art provides this ability, and it's still like therapeutic, right? People do art therapy for a reason. So I think I was like self-medicating with art as a really young person. There was a moment in my very first, maybe it was like my second black and white film class. I had an incredible instructor that emphasized content and narrative over technical ability. And I was way behind technically. I had to borrow a camera to take my first class, and my friend eventually gave it to me because I couldn't give it back. I would, struggle making the prints, and I would struggle getting the exposure right. But finally, I had made some strides, and the assignment was to do a panoramic with content. Right? And so we would come back to critique, and you had to have 3 panoramics with content, which back then meant that you had to shoot multiple 8x10s and like stitch them together and cut them all strange, which is really cool. And nobody could make a panoramic with content. They could make cool panoramics, but they weren't like telling a story or anything. And I was living in the gay arts district of Houston, and my neighbor had AIDS, HIV, and he was further along. His name was Marty. And sometimes like I was broke, but I would have like a buy one, get one lunch free, and I would always take Marty to lunch. And I remembered this moment where back then it was the 90s, and he pulled out his AIDS cocktail, which was 22 pills that he had to take before every meal. And I remember having this like physiological reaction, like it made me nervous, or maybe it like embarrassed me. Like everybody would know that Marty had AIDS, HIV. It was like a stigma back then. I loved him, I didn't care, but I noticed this physiological reaction. And so I went back home. I said, Marty, this happened. Do you think we could recreate this? And I could do this panoramic with content for my class, right? And so we went into the restaurant, and he laid down all of his 22 pills, and I had everybody in the restaurant stop and stare at him. And I took these photographs of the moment, right? And I took it back, and basically I knocked it out of the park. It ended up on a billboard, and the rest was kind of history. I saw this medium of photography as something so amazing that you could create a moment. You could create 1,000 moments in one image.